A giant fell, crumpled and tossed by the circumstances of life, reminiscent perhaps of a crumpled page from yesterday's newspaper, buffeted by an unwanted high wind. The fallen page tells the story of a man whose name was Harold Fitzgerald Hoyte, of his love for his family, of his building of the Nation newspaper and group of companies, in fact, of his building of a nation. And for me, it tells the story of a friendship that goes back 41 years. It is a story of a publishing house that Harold Hoyte built with a dream and determination. He built it with unquestionable integrity. He built it with raw talent, that of his own and other people. He built it with unwavering tenacity, and he built it with unbridled testicular fortitude. And 46 years after he built that house, it still stands on Fontebelle, giving voice to the people of this nation. And indeed, that is why this house was built. It was built to ensure that Barbadians had a mirror to themselves. It was built in post-colonial Barbados 6 years after independence, 7 years after independence, so that those who were voiceless, those who were not represented by the news of the day, those who were underprivileged and poor and felt that they had no place in society, could find a place and a voice and an expression. And it was built to show a small nation that you could be the best. It mirrored the expression of the then Prime Minister, friends of all and satellites of none. It was built that we could be better informed, that we would be better educated, that we would be able to understand, discuss the issues of the day, the implications and consequences of those issues, and to express how we felt about them. The First Nation appeared on the streets of Barbados. It was dated 1973, November, but it appeared on the 24th of November. It was 2 days after my 12th birthday. I was living on Baxter's Road at the time, and a sign went up saying, "The Nation," but nobody knew what it was. It was in a neighborhood of mixed use, some savory, some unsavory. It was on the corner almost of Subtle and Reed Streets, and it was in the shadow of the wall of the St. Mary's Church. And perhaps that is why God blessed the enterprise, because from the onset, they were grounded in faith. Like the people living in the city, I was curious about what it meant. I saw these big-haired black men going into the Nation, a one-door place in an unprepossessing building. Al Gilts, I later found their names, Harold Hoyte, Carl Moore, Charles Harding. And like people who lived in the city, we were curious about what was going to go on there. We learned that there would be a newspaper, and the people of the city got very excited about it. Don't mind that the Daily News, a white newspaper, had just collapsed. Here were black men getting together for the first time to give the country a newspaper. What would it be like? What did they have to say? Do they have anything to say at all? Al Gilts was known because he was at the Advocate. And word spread, they had no money for advertising, by word of mouth, as the city people would come in and ask and look around and go back and spread the news. And there was a woman called Pushan. Now remember, I'm looking through the eyes of a 12-year-old. She was petite, short, big bottom. Now, when you hear Pushan, you know that she's a small woman because it's an abbreviation for Lilliputian. What she didn't have in size, she made up for in voice. And Pushan would walk about every day. The paper come in, the paper come in. When I got to bed, the men down there working hard enough day and night. When the paper get out, you got to buy one, you got to buy one. And Pushan carried on. She was the biggest advertiser you could ever want. So when the paper finally came out, it was intended to be 7,500 copies of 20 pages. They printed 20,000 copies of 48 pages, and they sold like hot bread that the cheese was waiting for, like salt bread that the cheese was waiting for. Every single copy was taken up. And that newspaper was written in an easily readable format. The stories were frank and forthright, but most of all, on the front page was people who looked like us. And that was significant because days before, the Advocate newspaper had carried a story on its front page of Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Spiro Agnew, the Vice President of the United States. And on the bottom of the front page, like a footnote, was a story about Errol Barrow, as he then was Prime Minister of Barbados, saying that he was going on leave for a year to teach in Florida. The paper did not ask any of the questions. What does this mean? Is he abandoning the Democratic Labour Party? Well, how can a Prime Minister take a year off? Does it mean the BLP will win the next election? None of the issues that mattered to Barbadians was interrogated in that front page. And this galvanized the founders that something had to be done to create a voice to deal with Barbadian issues. One decision that was taken very early was that the paper would be free of political interference or input, and Harold retained that to the end. He kept the paper free from political favor, and he was unfearful of politicians. In fact, many of them feared him because you have to be frightened for a man who bought ink by the barrel, not by the bottle. So determined was Harold to keep himself free of politics and to protect the reputation of the nation that when in 2008 Prime Minister David Thompson offered him a diplomatic appointment, he refused it. And he refused it on the ground that he had not worked so hard to build his reputation as a journalist and to protect the nation's reputation as non-partisan, to come in the evening of his career to have that reputation taken away by what people would perceive as a partisan appointment. Now think about that. He is retired. He is putting the Nation newspaper and the nation of Barbados first, refusing an appointment that people would have jumped at. But I am getting ahead of myself. I said that I was 12 at the time. In the intervening years, the paper had become an institution which strengthened Barbados's democracy. You cannot have a strong democracy unless the people of the country have a voice. And that's what the Nation newspaper gave to them. You cannot have a stable democracy without a vigilant press, and that is what the Nation newspaper gave to the country. You cannot have a stable and strong democracy unless people are willing to stand in the breach, and when politicians waver from the straight and narrow, stand up and say, here am I, and I will speak for and on behalf of them. And that is what Harold Hoyte and the Nation did. So when I was 15, and to tell you the truth, I don't even know how I did it. I took out an old-time writing pad. Young people wouldn't know what that is. And I wrote a letter in longhand. Dear Mr. Hoyte, I am a regular reader of your newspaper. I love it, and so on. And in it I said to Harold, but Mr. Hoyte, the paper is excellent, but there is no material in it for young people. There is no youth column. There are no articles that specifically are of interest to young people, just general information. Could you please have a youth column? I would be willing to write it. Remember, I'm 15 years old. And to my amazement, the CEO of the Nation wrote to me back on the Nation's letterhead and invited me to meet with him. I went into his office open-mouthed. Here were my heroes, the people whose names I read and whose images I saw writing every week. And I was there, me, 15 years old, Liz Thompson from Baxter's Road. And he talked to me at length, and then he asked me to write some things for him, and I did, all in longhand, no computer. And then he said to me, Ms. Thompson, I would wish to offer you the position of the youth writer for the Nation newspaper. What? And I called it Teen Talk, and I wrote for 3 years. There were at that time very few women in journalism. And remember, I was a girl and a school child. Later on, when I was admitted to the bar, and it did cause some controversy that Harold had picked up this school child and had her writing in the paper and so on, and a girl to boot. Later on, I wrote a column again to fill a void called Know Your Rights. Neither Harold nor I appreciated it at the time, but that too caused controversy because in the legal establishment of the day, it was felt that I was breaching the law and the rules and that Harold was enabling me for his own benefit because we were advertising and lawyers were not supposed to advertise. But it is that letter written to Harold as 15 years old, at 15, that I mark as the beginning of our friendship. The Nation was doing very well selling newspapers, but they had a major problem. They had come up against the establishment of the day. White corporate Barbados did not want this interloper. The Advocate was now under pressure. The Advocate was white-owned outside of Barbados. And therefore, a decision was taken that no corporate advertising would be given to the Nation, so the Nation had no money. Al Jilks recalls that many a time he would go to the bank and have to signal to the waiting staff outside and turn and go back out. There would be no money to meet payroll. Harold and Sir Fred mortgaged their houses without the knowledge of their wives. And remember, these were men with little children. Such was their determination to keep the paper going. But the key was how to get advertising. It was solved in part by Chefette, which became the first big advertiser. Chefette was owned by Syrians. They too were outsiders. They too were located not far away in the city. And that helped a little bit. And then the big breakthrough came when the courts in the UK noticed how many copies the Nation was selling and asked its branch in Barbados why it was not advertising there. And Wilfred Field, who was young and was dispatched as the sales manager to get the courts advertising. The owners came down and met. And they put a rate to Wilfred that was way below the advertising rate. Harold had instructed Wilfred, do not come back without the court's account. Wilfred did not negotiate. Before the owner could finish saying, we are going to give you X, yes, we'll take it. And Harold knew, because he had an unerring instinct for what would happen with newspapers, that if he could get a company as big as Courts, that it would break the stranglehold that the Advocate had, and advertising from corporate Barbados, which he needed, would pour in. In the meanwhile, something very interesting had happened. They had no advertising to fill the pages. Mark Williams one day suggested, and in this is part of the genius of Harold. I said that Harold used his talent and others. Harold could hear a good idea, and his always was the vision, the direction, the leadership, the instruction, seeing it and knowing that it would link with this or that and pulling it on together and pushing and driving the nation to break new barriers. Mark's idea, Mark Williams, was that there were a lot of small businesses that needed advertising. Give them a cheap rate, give them a little square in the paper, and let them advertise there. Nobody paid any attention, but Harold said, I think Mark onto something. So Mark went out, and in those days, there used to be dances every Saturday night. And the dances would be advertised by people distributing flyers, by posters attached to utility poles with nails. When people passed who didn't like the people who were sponsoring the dance, they would strip and rip them down. They would come off as the rain wet them. It was really not an effective means of advertising. So Mark, being again from the area, went to some of these people and said, would you advertise, please? And pretty soon, there were so much dance advertisements that they did not have enough space. The dance ads sold like hot pork chops on a Friday night at a dance. You didn't have enough. Somebody who used to advertise regularly were two men called Boo and Bitema. Boo and Bitema used to have a dance every Boxing night. Bitema was a fish vendor from the Fairfield area. When Bitema was on his deathbed in 2013, he summoned Harold Hoyte to his bedside. He summoned one of the most powerful, wealthy men in the country. He summoned the director, the editor-in-chief emeritus of the nation. He summoned the doctor of letters to come into his house at Fairfield, and Harold Hoyte went. Because Harold Hoyte remembered that when he needed advertising money, men like Bitema gave it to him. And Harold sat down. Bitema told me later when I went to see him, because Bitema and I were all so close, as indeed he was close to the Prime Minister, and he predicted that we could not win the 2013 election. He was right. Bitema said to me, Harold came to see me, and I made a deathbed request. I didn't ask what it was, and he didn't share. Later, Harold said to me with tears in his eyes that he had gone to see Bitema. Bitema had made a request of him, and that he had carried it out to the letter. Harold had a way of bridging the social divide, the racial divide, the age gap. Harold just fitted it all. He was such an exceptional, remarkable, unusual man. And Bitema's request was carried out. I said just now that Harold bridged all divides. Initially, the paper was taken up by blacks in Barbados, but then corporate Barbados started to read it and to advertise in it. And Harold, again, the very people who had rejected him, Harold reached out to. In fact, Rastus Edgell, one of the occasions on which the nation had no money to meet payroll, Harold had gone to Harrison College with him and saw Harold standing dejected on the street, Rastus, and he said to him, what happened, Harold? And Harold told him, payday's in 2 days, and I ain't got no money. He wrote Harold a check, paid the staff for that week. And then white people started to write for the Nation. Because the Nation had not just become the black newspaper or the newspaper of these upstart black men that people thought were mad. It had become the nation's newspaper. And so Richard Hoyte and Patrick Frost and Fab Hoyos and Pam Girton and Desmond Bourne and others, because the paper was now reflecting the full social and economic complexion and landscape of our country. But the paper was pioneering, and I'm talking about the paper because, as I said, the story of the Nation is Harold Hoyte's story. They were starting to get a lot of readership. They then determined that Harold determined that he would have spectacular photographs, and then you got the cricket photography. You got those wonderful front page photographs by Ronnie Carrington in the magazine, and there was an iconic one of two half-dressed little children butting a cow coming around a corner. And the cow was staring at them, and they were staring, and Ronnie captured it in the moment, this rural scene of a cow and two kids. And then Gordon did the cricket photography. But something happened in the intervening years, and it was that Harold determined that it wasn't just to tell our story. He had to cover the diaspora, and that Barbados was located in the Caribbean. It had to be a Caribbean newspaper, so that the Caribbean had to be reflected on the pages of the paper. Because Barbados' story is the story of a part of an island chain washed by the Caribbean Sea, and he needed, therefore, to capture that. And he would take Algilts and dispatch him when the Soufriere erupted. When there was the coup in Grenada, he called Al at 4:30. He said, Al, I am not telling you to go. I am not asking you to go. I am not begging you to go. But I am telling you, if you want to go, I have a pilot and a plane on standby. Al said, Harold, you know me, I going. And he went, and as the plane descended, young men who had no experience handling guns started to shoot. One shot off his toe, but thankfully, Al and the plane survived, and we got the news from Grenada as to what was happening there. But the first story was of Captain Ferguson, lost at sea, as we would say with a little white girl, 19 years old. They had set out on a little boat to sail down the Grenadines and disappeared. 12 days later, they had not reached any port anywhere in the Caribbean, and they were feared dead. She was a British girl, but you have to speak in the Barbadian vernacular. That's what we would have said. And Harold picked Al up and said, find Captain Ferguson. And Al went and eventually was able to find out that Captain Ferguson and the young lady had picked up an unusual current and drifted in a direction where they wouldn't normally. And they were found half dead, without food or water, in the boat by a freighter, which picked them up and took them to Spain, which was its next port of call. Well, Al said to Harold, Al, you going to Spain? They begged for a ticket, and they put Al on a plane, and they sent him to, He landed eventually, I think he got there partly by boat as well. He landed at a place called Santurce, and they said that there was a seaman's lodging at which he could stay if he was a seaman. And he said, yes, I am a seaman. I have come to find my captain, Captain Ferguson. And he found him, and that was the first story that Harold pursued. If something has happened in Barbados to Barbadians, prominent or poor, the Nation was going to tell you what had happened and why. And that was the first external story. And that is important, because in post-colonial Barbados, the Nation had the role and the responsibility, Harold felt, of defining us internally and externally. Because people reading the newspaper outside of Barbados, not only were we seeing a view of ourselves internally, but people reading us externally were seeing a view of a country and how it was evolving under black leadership as a micro-state with a small population whose prospects were not considered as particularly good. And then there was the column Dear Christine, which became massively popular. Now, Dear Christine, people laugh, was of extreme importance because there were women all across this country encountering problems in relationships, with raising children, with engaging with the social services, and they had no outlet. And Charles Harding and Al realized that this was something that they could and should address. And the two of them were the first Dear Christine. Al wrote letters to Charles, and Charles wrote letters to Al, pretending to be women having problems, all with Harold looking on and encouraging them, yes, yes, no, but no, say that this and say that, and the letters are. And then they published these letters and answers, Dear Christine. Now, Christine was for those of you who remember the Profumo scandal, Christine was actually named after Christine Keller. So you see what a whole thing this was. Some of you would get the implications of that. Christine Keller brought down a British government. So Dear Christine became very popular. And then after a while, they had to stop because there were so many letters coming in that they really had to take it seriously. Women from all over Barbados were writing about all kinds of issues, and it was at that stage that they asked, she then became Dame Olga. Olga Lopeseel became the next Christine, and she wrote for years, and I won't tell you who were the people after that. Harold had I was never one. Harold had to a sense that the diaspora was of significance, and in that regard, he asked Tony Best not to write, but to be the North American editor of the Nation newspaper. And it meant that a link was created. This is before Fern and network. These are not the days of cell phones. A link was created between people who had left Barbados and who had relatives overseas or were overseas and wanted to get a sense of what the various communities here and abroad were doing. And then Harold introduced political polling. Didn't exist before. And that was important not only as predictive of what the outcome of an election was, and they got far more right than wrong, but it was important because it meant that the electorate had an opportunity to indicate what their views were on various social and economic issues outside of the period of casting the vote, outside of the election cycle. So it was an important medium of democracy and spread of the expression of democracy as we know it. I spoke about the photographs, and Harold gave people opportunity. I told you how I just turned up and he took me on. Another young man walked into the Nation and said, and his door was always open to everybody, I don't want to sell any newspapers. I can't write. I like art. I know you ain't gonna employ me. Harold gave him the artistic direction of the newspaper. He's still at the Nation. And another one walked in from St. Leonard's and said, look, I'm a St. Leonard's boy, I don't have no academic qualifications, but I really, really want to be a journalist. Harold gave him a desk and a computer and said, let me see what you could do. He just created opportunity for people. And as people walked through the Nation, their reputations were built. And their names are planted across Barbados and across the Caribbean in the spheres of business, of advertising, of political polling and planning, all kinds of people. The nation became a bed for people to flourish. And for the first time ever, under Harold Hoyte, journalists in Barbados had a pension fund. He established a pension fund. He established a credit union. He sent people off for training, academic degrees, and short-term courses because he believed in the development of people. And he wasn't doing this about himself. He wanted to create something that we could be proud of, that we could understand, that we were worth something, that we had value, that we were important, that our story mattered, and that our story could be told with dignity. And the nation became successful and an icon in the Caribbean, and they invited Harold to come and set the Gleaner right. And Harold went and led the Gleaner for some time. And it came to the point where Radiofusion was owned by, they were having a lot of breaking stories, a lot of scoops, a lot of amazing headlines, whether it was Sidney Burnett Aline attempting to bring the coup. But it came to the point where the nation was doing very well. And they determined, the directors, some of them, that they would try to buy Radiofusion, which, as you know, was really the flagship radio at the time. And some of the directors went in 2 separate planes under cover of darkness to negotiate with the owner of the Radiofusion, Lord Thompson. They were successful. When the news broke, Alfred Pragnell, in his inimitable way, said, imagine last night I went to sleep working for Lord Thompson and get up this morning working for Lipmouth Lou. Because indeed, Jeanette Lane Clark had been one of the people who was in the planning, the early stages of the planning. Harold very much wanted to have a television license. It didn't happen, but I could only imagine what a television station run by Harold Hoyte, with his creative genius leading it, would have been like. And there was another area in which Harold again was pioneering, the introduction of cartoons. Winston Jordan's cartoons were famous in Barbados and outside of Barbados. He could just use a pen to lampoon a politician or to cast a scene about a social or economic event that captured in 4 lines and some images in an amazing way. And again, that was Harold's introduction. But Harold did not micromanage. He chose people and he let them loose to do what they could do. I talked to you about the photographs. Harold had an ability to admit when he was wrong. In the summer that after I turned 16, I went to work at The Nation as a reporter. There was then only one other female reporter, Marva Cossey. She was from St. Philip. There were reports of a set of blackbirds attacking people on the compound of the IDC. Charles Hackett, who was one of the photographers at the time, had been dispatched to get the photograph, and every time he came back, unsuccessful. Harold got angry. And you could tell when Harold was excited. He would giggle, he would chuckle, he would run out of his office, excited and animated and so on. But that day was vexed with Charles. Charles, well, how difficult can it be? Look, I'm going with y'all, I'm coming. So we got into the car and we drove up the road, Charles, Harold, and I. Charles and I stood one way. He says, where you have to go to get this picture now? And we directed Harold in the general direction where it was said that the birds were attacking. Harold walked out. So what's going to happen now? Harold is standing there looking at us with great skepticism. Charles is standing, camera in hand, and I, like a faithful reporter, I got my notepad and my pen. Without warning and with great swiftness, a flock of birds descended on Harold's head. Harold started to duck and run and scream. And literally, Harold is running through the car park, ducking and screaming, and the birds are after him. Now, our boss is under attack, and we're frightened. We standing up, we don't know what to do. And in the middle of all of that, Harold shouts out, Charles, you get the picture, you get the picture. Charles is standing with his camera. He had not gotten the picture. At which point, Harold pulled himself up to his full height because the birds had gone and said, y'all get through, I'm going back to my office. Charles eventually got the photograph by literally going up to the IDC and just staying there and watching attack after attack until he got good enough shots to be published. But that's the kind of person that Harold was. By telling us he was going back to the office, we get through, Harold was conceding that really the matter was not quite as simple. He had misjudged. And he was like that. He could tell when he was wrong. He didn't feel badly about admitting. What Harold built was an institution of democracy in post-colonial Barbados which adapted to and with the times and gave people an opportunity for expression. But what was Harold like as a person? He was wonderful. He was wonderful. Bright, articulate, engaging, loved a good argument, intellectually stimulating, and he had a great sense of humor. And when he did not disarm you with his intellect, he would disarm you with humor. One day he and Glenn Murray were having an argument. Glenn was winning the day with the force of his arguments. Harold realized he was on the ropes but wouldn't concede defeat, shouted to those who were there, oh, don't mind Glenn Murray, he born naked, don't pay him no attention. People cracked up because the way he had put it was as if Glenn Murray was the only person ever to be born naked. But that, he had a great sense of humor, and his kids, his children, Bobby and Tracy, benefited from that. Wherever Harold was, there was laughter. In fact, on the day that Harold was struck down, before he was struck down, he was making sport. He was with his family. He loved his family dearly. He believed that his sisters were brighter than he was, and that if y'all had been born in different times, that y'all would have gone so much further than he had. He used to say this to me all the time. He loved you dearly. His children, Bobby and Tracy, were the light in his eyes. Bobby says that he thought of Harold as being the expression of the fruits of the Spirit because he caused him always to use his long-suffering and forbearance. When asked why he didn't go into journalism, he said Harold was losing so much trees to print the paper, he had to become a landscape architect. Tracy says that he was the best father ever. I'd said that Harold liked to laugh, and on the day that he was struck down, he was joking with his family. Harold was trying to lose weight, and Harold was simple. Sir George reminded me last week that one day Harold and I promised to take him out to dinner. He got all dressed up. Harold and I came laughing, and we got into the car and we drove. We took him to Baxter's Road. We carried him in Pink Star, and then we put him to sit on the corner of Baxter's Road and said, this is the best fish you're going to ever taste. And that's where he had dinner. But he loved spending time with his family. They did it every summer. They did it whenever they had a chance. They would go cruising. They would come here. He would go to Canada, or they would go to other places. And on that last day, he was with his family. Harold was looking forward to retiring, to stopping, to not doing anything else. He felt that his time was passing. He would say all the time he had only 2 friends in politics, and they were both called Thompson, and then he got 2 other friends whose names were M. Y'all can't work out who I'm talking about. But it was interesting, and this is another aspect of Harold's personality. He was completely confidential. It was amazing that he could be friends with David Thompson and Mia Motley, as she then was, morning Prime Minister, and that he would not disclose to each other anything that one of us shared. He was an amazing friend. When my father died, he stood at my side in pouring rain while my father was lowered into the ground. When I won the International Prize for Work in Environment, Harold stood at my side. Always, always, on the day that I was relieved of my duties as a cabinet minister, I called my parents, my sister, and Harold Hoyte. Harold left the nation immediately without telling them that there was a huge story about to break, and came to the ministry. I tried to get Harold to leave. I couldn't. I begged him to go. I said, Harold, the story is going to break. I do not want you to be photographed here. He was caught as he left the ministry, and Harold walked out without saying a word to the press, even though I had just told him everything that was in my head. But I knew that with Harold it was safe. And that was important, that as a paperman, even though Harold loved to get news of all types, he was very confidential, and he respected people's space. He respected people of all walks of life. He never used the paper for vicious or personal attack, but always for higher purpose, to interrogate the issues, but not to personally attack anyone, even when people offended or abused him. On that last day, Harold was with his family. He was looking forward to writing. He had done about 9 books. He was working on another. And again, that is an important part of his contribution, the socio-economic and socio-political history which those pages and those books reveal. And he was eating cake, which he should not have done. Now, I want to say, because I'm sure they're here, I spoke about how simple Harold was. On Friday nights, Harold and I would spend our time in a place in Ferniehurst called the Senate, discussing politics and other issues at an establishment owned by Nigel Proprietor Bailey and his brother. And we did that for years. People knew if they wanted to see us on Friday nights, you could come down there and find us. And there was wonderful engagement there. On the day that he was struck down and he was last himself, Harold was eating cake, which he was not supposed to do. And when he was challenged by his family, he said, "What cake you talking about? I got no cake. You see cake in my house?" Always, always to the end. And his mind remained absolutely clear to the end. At Easter, when I came to visit him, Tracy was sitting on one side of his bed and I was sitting on the other. I recognized that Harold was getting agitated. And Tracy said, Dad, what's wrong?" And he shook his hand, lost the capacity to speak, and he pointed at Tracy. And I knew immediately what he was saying. I said, "Harold, you do not want to hear the details about which he's taking. You don't about which we're talking. You don't want to hear what Tracy's saying." He said, No. I said, "But you want to hear all my business as usual." And he went. So to the end, that playful mischief and the clear mind were very much with him. And in losing his capacity to speak, when I came to see Harold in November, I think it was, and I said to him, there was a time when I had had a bad breakup in a relationship, and I was distraught, and I was crying a lot, and I was saying to Harold, "I'm praying really hard that." And Harold said to me, "But Liz, aren't you praying the wrong prayer? Shouldn't you be saying, if you are a woman of faith, shouldn't you be saying, God, I accept your perfect will for me, thy will be done? And in November, when I said to Harold, are you angry or bitter at what has happened to you? Mm-mm. Are you vexed with God? No. His faith was anchoring him in the darkest moment of his life. And it anchored him to the day he died. Harold had 3 wives. The first, Maureen, gave him his beautiful children. The second, Carolyn, showed him a different aspect of life and gave him much excitement. And when he met the third, Noreen, he met her at a party in the nation. He called me. He said, Miss Thompson, I meet a girl. The first thing that alarmed me was girl. I said, how old? He said, well, she's young. So, Harold, how young? He told me. I devolved into some language, asking him if his head was right. I said, Harold, you cannot be serious. And he went on to say what attracted him to her. She was dancing, and she caught his attention, this little brown-skinned girl from St. Thomas. That's what he told me. He said that though he liked his women dark, there was something about her that he liked. And he wanted her attention, but didn't know how to get it, and he hid her shoes. So when she was ready to leave, she couldn't find them. And Harold, ever the kind man that he was, helped her search the whole place for these shoes. And thereafter, Harold ensured that her shoes were next to his, under his bed. And there they remained until he drew his last breath with Noreen at his side. Noreen, Harold loved you. The very last conversation Harold had with me in December of 2017, before he was struck down, Harold spoke to me about how happy you had made him and how welcoming his home was and how justified he felt that he had chosen you. To the Hoytes, I want to say to you that Harold was the magnet that held that family together. Somebody else step in and be the magnet. Do not fall apart. Noreen has asked me to note that 7 is a number with tremendous significance biblically. Harold took ill on the last day of 2017. He was born on the 7th month of a year. He was 77 at the time of his death. They had been together for 17 years. She will celebrate alone their wedding anniversary on Wednesday. Today we take the measure of a man who was 70 and 7. For all he has done, we call him giant. We give him back to the God who loved him and lent him to us. And those of us who knew, loved, respected Harold Hoyte, the family of the nation companies, his family, and indeed our nation give grateful celebration for his life and his contribution. We acknowledge today that once a giant stood, and because he stood, all of us were able to stand straighter, taller, prouder, and we are better for the fact that he helped to build Barbados. And we say, Harold, we love you. Farewell in the arms of the Almighty God whom you served. Stop the presses. We have a breaking story. A giant fell.